Good afternoon, and welcome then to chapter 13 of these lectures on the history of the BBC, and we're going to be moving into the 1970s. Since earlier videos dealt with the Director Generals and the Commissions of Inquiry and such like things, I'm going to be spending quite a lot of time on programmes, and in particular television programmes, which were remarkable or which were influential during these periods. And I think this is good in a way because I can't remember which BBC producer said the BBC is the sum of its programmes, neither more nor less. Now, of course, he was being a little provocative, but I think it is very important to have a view of the history of the BBC which leaves a big space for its programmes, because otherwise you can get this strange and incorrect impression that the BBC is a complicated thing which the government did. And in fact, the government didn't do the BBC. The government established the BBC. The government decides how much money it should make, and so on. But of course, the government does not order programmes, and probably wouldn't be very good at it in any case. The government and the management of the BBC set the framework, and the creative teams create programmes and persuade BBC management to have a go. And then after that, BBC management, having a look at the audience figures and reactions of different groups in society, usually don't intervene, but might intervene for saying, oh, one series, that's enough. And occasionally will intervene saying, we don't want any more of that. We don't want any more of that. Or even, extremely occasionally, you can't put that on. And this is the sort of for very occasional censorship. So usually then the programs are made by creative teams within a framework which is set by the government and then by the BBC management. Now, of course, the creative teams are held by this because they make programs which they think the BBC management will accept, because nobody wants to work very hard for months and months and months to produce something which is then going to be rejected. Yeah? And so there's very much a self-control going on, that the creative teams limit themselves. But of course, in many areas of broadcasting are not controversial. And if you're producing a quality cooking program or a science program or a children's television program or a musical program or a drama series, very often you will not have any serious worries about what the management will think about it, but it can happen. So moving into the 1970s, we're in this period then when there are three channels on your television. Yeah, you still, as I remember correctly, you still don't have a remote control. You have to get up and walk across the room. It was very tiring. That is to say, ITV, organised by a different company in different regions of the country, Granada in Lancashire, London Weekend Television in London at the weekend, Thames Television in London during the week. These are different separate companies who produce programmes, and the IBA, the Independent Broadcasting Authority, make sure they don't break any rules, like too many minutes of advertising or rude things before 9 o'clock at night or too much violence or etc., etc. So this is a time when there's the ITV and then BBC One and BBC Two. BBC Two a bit more intellectual. And there's quite a lot of competition going on, because the BBC know that in a few years' time they'll be asked to account when they ask to renew the charter again, or maybe ask for a higher license fee so they can invest more money in programmes. Then the government will be saying, well, yes, okay, show me the quality, show me the audience figures, let's see what we think about this. So in the 70s, then, here are a small number of the more celebrated programs. This is an ITV one, not a BBC program. This is an ITV program called Upstairs, Downstairs, and it's about the life of a rich family and the life of their servants. Does this sound familiar? Of course, it sounds familiar. It's the same story fundamentally as Downton Abbey, except that it does seem to me that the democratic spirit has made some progress, and that the servants were portrayed in a much less rounded and human manner in Upstairs, Downstairs in the early 1970s. 1971 to 77, than today in Downton Abbey, although I do think that Downton Abbey today is still fundamentally a conservative series. So that was on ITV. What else was on ITV? The ITV produced The World at War, which was a documentary series about the Second World War. And I wanted to mention this example because, as I will be showing, I hope, the BBC produced a large number of documentary series which were which were very well renowned. And independent commercial television, being more dependent on the immediate number of viewers compared with what's on at the same time or the other, this certainly was not so much their strong point. I will come back to that. But The World at War was a commercial television quality documentary series. Now, meanwhile, on the BBC in the 1970s, here are a couple of the programs which people were talking about. In 1976, then this drama series, Claudius. And you can see it there, illustrated with an unlikely Roman mosaic. And this was Roman history from the point of view of one of the members of a ruling family, and was very much well accepted at the time, and considered to be perhaps be both entertaining, because you know what Roman emperors' history is, people organizing to kill each other and stuff like that, all good fun, but also perhaps some aspects of an educational intent, because of course, you know, we don't know, your ordinary person doesn't know that much about Roman history, and so it could be argued that it was a something of an educational content. That was 1976. Also on then the BBC, not the 9 o'clock news, 1979 to 1982. Set up quite high standards for comedy. This is a topical comedy. This is some jokes about this week's news. Now, today in 2021, if you go over to the BBC website and you check out the Friday evening comedy, which is sometimes the Now Show and sometimes the News Quiz, you see, in my opinion, some of the best topical comedy in the world, but not the 9 o'clock news is part of the heritage and part of the background of this, the genealogy of this, and it was really jokes about this week's news. So part of it was recorded just before the show went on. So what can we say then year by year? Well, in 1979, BBC local radio stations were launched and gained a certain amount of popularity. People did want to have a local radio station. And this is also the year when the 9 o'clock news, not the 9 o'clock news, but the 9 o'clock news was produced for the first time, and has been on the BBC One every night since then. 1970 is also a key moment in that on Radio 1 they hired their first woman disc jockey. This is important because although in 1967, when they established Radio 1, all-day pop music just as hip and exciting as the pirate radio stations had been, well, they felt very avant-garde. They were showing you the latest music and the chirpiest modern way of being. And yet they hired a team of 20-odd people, all of the men, every single one a man. And so that's an interesting idea. So it seems that being hip and up-to-date in 1967 didn't seem to require having a respect for the role of women in a public space. Slightly depressing reflection there. But in 1970, they did hire Nightingale, who just wanted that job and was so determined and loved being a disc jockey. I think I've already mentioned her. What's wonderful about her is that she's now 80 years old and she's still a disc jockey on Radio 1. Well, what were the arguments they used at the time? Well, that when they first hired her, her first show was a Sunday evening one. And this was not an accident, because the management opinion was that daytime radio was for housewives. And they wanted to listen to husband substitutes on the radio. I'm not making this up. And they considered that they considered that daytime radio was for housewives. Whereas, in fact, very quickly, lorry drivers and in case in factories and so on, there were many other people watching, and that housewives did not want to listen to women. This was the received wisdom of BBC management. And as you can imagine, there were not a lot of men in that BBC management. So there she is, Annie Nightingale. Important role because the disc jockey tells us what it is to be modern, what is the music which really speaks to our experience. And so it's a very authoritative role. And indeed, I'm sure that these days disc jockeys have more influence than priests or bishops. Also, 1971, the first programs then for the Open University, our broadcaster. You remember the Open University was described by Harold Wilson as the project of all his political life of which he was proudest, and it allowed people who had not managed to go to university to later follow, get a degree at home. And this is in a period when most people did not go to university. Remember, I don't have the figures, but certainly in the 1970s, it was far, perhaps 20-30% maximum of any given age group that would go to university. 1971 was also the first time that the BBC Two put out the Old Grey Whistle Test. The Old Grey Whistle Test is a popular music program, and it is particular in that it was the popular music program which took popular music seriously and allowed new groups to come on and play for 20 minutes, not just 3 minutes, and interview. And they interviewed rockers and so on and so forth. And you can see the logo there, or the ident, which shows this human being floating around among the stars, which was perhaps a significant symbol for 1970s popular music. By 1972, there had been changes in the organisation, indeed on the law, connected to television, and they lifted the restrictions on broadcasting hours. That previously, it was written in the contracts that the BBC and ITV television were not allowed to produce programmes before such and such an hour. And there are two sides of this. First of all, it's a recognition of people having more varied schedules. But perhaps more significantly, it's an increase in the recognition of the power of the consumer. And so the idea is that, well, people should be able to watch television whenever they want. And it's not the government or the BBC management's job to decide for them. This is a very, very slow change over many decades of people's individual lives being left more alone by public authorities. The 1972, and here we're under the Conservative government of Edward Heath, then a new decision by the government takes the radio monopoly away from the BBC, and so local private radios, commercial radios, are licensed for the first time. This is also the period of the rapid spreading of colour television, and I think I remember correctly that by 1975, half of all the licenses sold are colour television licenses. In comedy, there are, I'm just going to give you a small number of examples. There was a very popular sitcom called Are You Being Served, which takes place in a department store, think La Samaritaine or something like that. So in the 70s, and has a small group of very colourful characters. There's one person you can't see there, Mrs. Slocum, who acts very bourgeois, but it's in fact not at all bourgeois. There is the young lady who's being very working class all the time, and Captain Peacock, again very obsessed with looking upper class. And this is an interesting point because there are a huge number of British sitcoms which are full of jokes about what class are you part of, and what class do you feel part of, and what class would you like to be part of? And so it's interesting. So I think sitcoms are British sitcoms in any case like to explore this idea, perhaps because it's an idea which worries people, which concerns people. But the Are You Being Served is better known for the character in the middle, Mr. Humphreys, who was homosexual at a time when this was shocking. Although it was legal, it was still shocking, and so certainly nobody in the series ever pronounced the word gay or homosexual. That's for sure. They didn't say it. It was just a continual joke. So this is obviously pretty homophobic. That it's considered that to be homosexual is funny in itself, and this joins a long tradition of humour 100 years ago in Britain. In many circles, to talk about somebody being Jewish was considered funny in itself. So that's how oppression in humour works. Now, some people said, oh, well, he's a very nice guy, so he's a homosexual in public and everybody likes him, so that's positive. But I think that the general weight of opinion these days is that homosexuals being melodramatic and ridiculous was not a move forward to put this stereotype on television. Lesbians were completely invisible at this time, and this was where the representation of gay men was at. I don't know if I mentioned this already, but in comedy, for example, in the Monty Python series, in the Monty Python sketches, the most well-known sketches, which we remember today, are generally unobjectionable, but they also produced a whole series of very homophobic sketches, which have been quietly and happily forgotten since. So I think it's fairly clear that the representation of gay people on television is an important section and makes a big difference, both reflecting and encouraging particular attitudes within the wider population. If we go back to informing, we have in 1972, yes, am I still in 1972? I think so. Yes, we're still in 1972. We have the arrival of a completely new kind of program. You remember the creative teams in the BBC are always looking for something new. What new kind of program can we come out with? Something that people want to watch and which we can persuade BBC management to fund, yeah? And this was Newsround, and certainly it has to be said that it's a success because it's still being produced today. And what is Newsround? Well, Newsround is a children's program, and it's about the news. It's a news bulletin for 6 to 11-year-olds, and it attempts to explain to children certain aspects of the week's news. I have put a links to, there are several episodes on YouTube, and I've put the links to them on my blog recently. So this is a fascinating idea, the news for 6 to 11-year-olds. I've seen examples in France of newspapers for 6 to 11-year-olds, but I don't remember having seen anything on the television. Now, defenders of public service television, defenders of the BBC, could easily argue that this is a good example of an innovative programme which would have difficulty surviving on a commercial channel. And the fact that it has survived from 1972 until 2021 is no doubt evidence that it was able to keep significant audiences happy. That's John Craven, who was the first presenter of this. Do go and have a look on YouTube. It's quite exciting. So what else do we have? Yes, this is also the year when, for the first time, you get regular shows in stereo. Radio 2 and Radio 4 begin broadcasting in stereo in southeast England, and gradually over the next few years, you can hear stereo radio across the country. And this no doubt helped radio to survive the competition with television. The sound quality was somewhat better. Now, to go back to the question of documentary series, I'm very interested in documentary series because it seems that, of course, people who defend the BBC like to say the BBC produces better quality programmes than commercial television. unfortunately, it's very difficult to define quality, and it can be quite difficult to prove that BBC programmes are in general of better quality. However, there are certain areas where the argument seems particularly strong. The documentary series is one of them, where I mentioned that ITV, the commercial television, produced The World at War, a quality presentation about the Second World War. I'm going to mention to you 6 or 7 or 8 examples of documentary series produced by the BBC, which were of quality and gained quite a wide popular audience. And if I'm going to mention 7 or 8, it's no doubt because there are 15 or 16 or 20, you know. So this is certainly an area where it feels to me like the BBC was very strong. Here's one example. This is a 1972 series of 30-minute films created by John Berger, Ways of Seeing. It's the history of art. It's the history of art. Quite radical, quite a little radical, quite a lot of reflection on the representation of women in art, for example. But what is perhaps interesting of it is that, you know, as you can imagine, you know, when you think of popular television that will bring the millions in, you don't think, oh yeah, we better do a documentary series on the history of art. That'll get the millions in. But in fact, it was extremely popular. It got a very wide audience, and you know, not as wide as Coronation Street perhaps, but it got out to millions of people. And so certainly the BBC could point to this and say, look, we successfully get a documentary series on history of art out to large numbers of people. The other thing which is very notable about the successful documentary series is that they very often promote a personal view. So this is John Berger, who is the presenter, and you see him going around different museums and going from town to town and around the world and showing buildings and so on. And so there's very much this individual trying to talk to you, and it's not the form of the documentary where we, here we have Professor Peter Bloggs. Yeah, what do you think, Professor? Oh, well, I remember that I always do. They can be pretty boring. So pretty chirpy, but also series documentary series. Meanwhile, as we move into 1973. I'll be talking in a moment about sitcoms. Now, just a little reminder about the 1970s. The 1970s is going to see the end of the post-war boom. Of course, people don't realize it's coming. A large amount of political and social turmoil. There are 4 elections in the 1970s, one in 1972, in 1974, and one in 1979. And then in 1976, we have a change in prime minister. So there's a lot going on. Enormous strikes in 1972, in 1974, and pretty big strikes in 1978. Certainly the more strikes in the 1970s than in the 1980s or the 1990s or the years 2000 than any time since. And this was a very high point in conflict between employers and employees, in particular because while the boom was going on, very often companies would say, oh, well, okay, a wage rise, yeah, okay. But as it became harder for companies to make profits, the conflict became much, much sharper. And certainly in 1972, the elite, certainly at the top of the Conservative Party, they were extremely frightened of revolutionary upheaval. Now, I'm not saying that revolutionary upheaval was probable. I think it was not probable, but certainly sections of the elite really believed that it could be or would be or had been. In any case, this is a sitcom, The Last of the Summer Wine. The reason I'm mentioning is because it became the longest running sitcom in the world, running for 37 years. There you go. In the same, going back to documentaries, The Ascent of Man is a series on the history of science, on the history of science, presented by British mathematician and historian of science Jacob Bronowski. So again, history of science, it's quite a heavy subject for most ordinary people. And remember, most people have not been to university. And again, this was pretty successful stuff. And I think one of the strongest arguments of people who want to defend the BBC. 1973, also moving away from the programs for a moment. In 1973, there was a big report published on the position of women in the BBC. And it showed that things had moved forward extremely slowly. And indeed, Suzanne Franks, who wrote a whole series of things about the question of women in the BBC, suggested that changes which were demanded by the women's movement in the 1960s, and which was sometimes mentioned in the laws of the 1970s, began to become everyday experience at the end of the 1980s. Now, of course, for young people, the 1960s, the 1970s, and 1980s, well, it's all last century. It doesn't sound very long, but it took 20, 30 years after the demands of the women's movement of the 1970s for things to seriously happen. So the 1973 report on women in the BBC showed that only 5% of senior management were women. And when they interviewed male managers in the BBC, they found a lot of prejudices against girls and against women. Many male managers said, listeners and viewers will not take women's voices seriously, so women should not read the news. One of the managers said, those women who are dedicated to their job in broadcasting, well, they are not really women. And another said that women employed in the BBC did not want promotion. So this confidential report was presented to the all-male management, and it was decided to have a regular study of the position of women in the BBC. But it's really only in the middle of the 1980s that things started to change. If we move into 1984, we have another example. Sorry, 1974, we have another example of one of these popular documentary series. The Fall of Eagles is a 13-part British television drama. You can watch it on YouTube if you like that sort of thing. And it's called The Fall of Eagles because it deals with the historical events from 1848 to 1918, which was not a good time for the emperors and empires of Europe. And it deals with the ruling dynasties of Austria-Hungary, the Habsburgs, of Germany, the Hohenzollerns, and of Russia, the Romanovs. So it looks at three of the huge empires which had dominated many countries each, and how and why they fell. There is probably more space given to the lives of the people at the top than perhaps somebody like me would like, but there's a lot more. It's very explicative, it's very popular, it's quality things. 1974 is also the time of the introduction of CFAX. CFAX was a service on your television. And by now we have remote controls, and you used your remote control to choose which page you wanted. So if I can give you an example here, there you go. So if you're on BBC One CFAX, you take your remote control and you type 101, and about 2 minutes later, the news headlines appear. Now, it sounds like the internet, but extremely bad. However, you have to put it back into the context of the time. If you want the news headlines, any time of day or night, you can have the news headlines, which are regularly updated. Your alternative was to have the news on the radio once an hour, perhaps, or wait till tomorrow morning and go to the newsagents and buy a newspaper. So although it does seem ridiculously slow compared with what we know today, or what we have today, it was the first time you could get real-time news, real-time weather, real-time television and radio programs, and also this allowed, for the first time, I think, subtitles for the deaf and hard of hearing on BBC programs. This whole thing continued until 2012, and it was an interesting point in itself. It just shows that after the internet was more and more generalized, there was still a whole section of the population, in particular older people, who did not have the internet or really know what it was, and continued using CFAX on their television. 1975 is marked by one of the best loved sitcoms in Britain, Fawlty Towers. This gentleman who runs a boarding house. Also, again, and this is getting quite repetitive. Again, the attitude of Basil Fawlty to social class and his great respect for the high classes is very much one of the themes involved here. What else is going on in 1975? They were having some difficulty with funding, and they decided to reduce the number of broadcasting hours. One of the dramas from 1975, which is perhaps the right time to talk about this, is Survivors, a post-apocalyptic fiction drama. You know what happened. It's about a group of people who have survived a terrible pandemic, which was accidentally released by a Chinese scientist and quickly spread across the world via air travel. Perhaps you should watch this next year and not this year. Going back to women, this is the time, 1975, where finally you get a regular newsreader who is a woman. This is Angela Rippon, and I already mentioned one of the reasons why this was important, and that is that the newsreader is the person who tells us how to understand the world. And so the fact that they're all men or all white or something like that is obviously a problem. 1976, one of the reactions to the news situation and the end of the post-World War boom was a rise in youth cultures which were particularly contestatory or rebellious, and of course punk rock is one of those. But interesting, the BBC, although we always imagine the BBC is tremendously respectable, played a very important role in the development of punk on the radio, because on Radio 1, John Peel every day, and here you can see an example of his 10 o'clock at night show. I don't know, it was every day, and four times a week at night, John Peel would play, and he would always play songs which were not very well known, that he thought were interesting. And he was the first person to champion punk rock on the radio, and later on other innovative forms. And so this is interesting, because it has been argued, with I think good reason, that he would never have survived on a commercial station, because a commercial station, the problem is, how many listeners do you have now? Because we want to ask the advertisers for a lot of money. And on a public service station, this is not necessary. Of course, you must have across the day and across the week a large number of listeners, but you don't have to be watching the number of listeners minute by minute. And so John Peel was able to introduce huge numbers of new singers and groups. Of course, many of them disappeared into sometimes deserved oblivion, but some became extremely well known. Interestingly enough, much more recently, when the BBC was arguing against quite a popular idea in government circles, which said that it's time that BBC Radio 1 and BBC Radio 2 are privatised. One of the arguments the BBC used said, well, the BBC puts forward kinds of popular music which are minority, avant-garde, experimental. And so this is the idea of the BBC as a public service. I think this is important, because when we talk about the radio and the role of the BBC in radio, we often get stuck with the old way of looking at things, which, you know, the most important thing is that the BBC should make people listen to classical music and opera. And this is it's not completely untrue, as we will see in the 80s. There was always plenty of money available for classical music. But the BBC has had time to develop different ways of looking at the world, and it's interesting to see the BBC saying, oh, well, yeah, look, don't privatise Radio 1 because it encouraged punk and rap and so on. Although, apparently, when John Peel was recommending punk on his radio programme, the top management, who obviously did not listen to Radio 1, did not really know, and one of them once said, well, I hope he's not playing punk on his radio program, and was in fact he was playing very little else. 1977 is the Annan report. I'm not going to go into it because a previous video did, but this idea of they suggested a new channel should be awarded to independent television, and this will eventually give rise to Channel 4, but sometime later. And the last thing I'm going to say here, because we're at the end of the 1970s, is I'm going to mention this 1977 program. This is the first edition of a new weekly magazine program for Asian women. Remember that in a British society, when we use the word Asian, we're thinking of Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi. For historical reasons. Now, this program, Garbar, for Asian women, was intended to run for 26 weeks, but then, in fact, ran for 500 weeks and ended in April 1987. And here you have a little example from 1981, in fact, and this shows people talking about Asian women talking to each other, about the importance of learning English, about child development, and another subject, another human interest subject. Listen, I've got to the end of the amount of time I like to spend on each one of these videos, so I'm going to stop here. But number 14 should be along in a few days' time. Thank you for listening.